The women had not expected to end their war this way. Herded under the gray sky of a collapsing Reich, boots crunching against the broken cobblestones as American guards motioned them forward. Their uniforms, once pressed with an air of purpose, hung loose now, seams frayed, fabric stained by weeks of retreat and hunger. Some clutched small canvas satchels stuffed with fragments of their former lives, a photograph wrapped in oilskin, a locket, a pair of knitting needles, a folded scrap of bread already growing hard. Behind them, the ruins of their homeland smoldered, smoke rising like black threads into the damp spring air. Before them stretched the unknown, captivity under the very enemy they had been raised to despise. For most of the world, prisoners of war conjured images of men, soldiers stripped of their rifles, trudging into barbed wire enclosures. Yet here were women of the Reich, auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, camp staff, drawn into the machinery of conflict and now swallowed by its end. Their faces revealed the paradox of their time, stern in posture, yet shadowed by uncertainty. A few carried themselves with defiance, lips pressed tight as if rehearsing a silent protest. Others stared blankly ahead, shoulders sagging, surrender having drained even the dignity of resistance. Among them was one woman who, years later, would write in her diary that she felt as though stepping out of a theater, only to realize the stage had burned down. She was 24, the daughter of a machinist, and she clutched her satchel with both hands as if it contained the only evidence of her existence. The journey began in silence, guarded convoys moving westward through villages reduced to rubble. The countryside, once lush with orchards, bore the scars of retreating armies. Charred tanks lined the roadsides, their metal husks rusting in the rain. Horses lay in the ditches, stiff legs jutting skyward like broken branches. Every mile carried the women farther from the world they knew, deeper into enemy custody. They whispered among themselves, guessing what awaited them across the Atlantic. Some imagined forced labor, others starvation camps. A few believed propaganda tales that painted America as a land of chaos, collapsing under its own contradictions. Yet behind their whispered fears was a fragile thread of curiosity. What did the enemy look like when seen not through posters and broadcasts, but through the clarity of lived captivity? When they reached the coast, the sea air struck them with unexpected sharpness. Salt stung their lips, the wind carrying the cries of gulls and the creak of wooden piers. The harbor was a hive of activity, American military police directing lines of prisoners toward the transport vessels. The ships themselves loomed like steel fortresses, their hulls painted gray, decks stacked with supplies. To the German women, they seemed impossibly vast, evidence of a power too immense to be merely imagined. Some craned their necks, eyes wide as they absorbed the sight, while others lowered their gaze, unwilling to grant awe to their captors. Yet the shock was undeniable. This was the face of an enemy not starving, not weakened, but thriving. Boarding was slow, mechanical, the women filing in groups beneath the watchful eyes of armed guards. The thud of boots on gangplanks mingled with the groan of engines below deck. Once inside, the air grew heavy with oil and sweat, the walls reverberating with the heartbeat of machinery. They were shown narrow bunks stacked in tiers, assigned corners where they would sleep shoulder to shoulder. The space smelled of metal and sea brine, but to some it also smelled faintly of safety. Away from the collapsing front lines, away from Soviet soldiers advancing relentlessly through the east. Captivity was bitter, but it was survival, and survival was suddenly precious. Days at sea blurred into one another. The Atlantic rolled beneath them, endless waves swallowing the horizon. At night, the women lay awake, rocked by the rhythm of the ship, listening to the muffled hum of conversations in languages foreign to their ears. Some wrote in notebooks, their words cramped and hurried, as if recording each thought would preserve a tether to the lives they had left behind. Others wept quietly, muffling their sobs against coarse blankets. A handful tried to preserve the semblance of camaraderie, whispering songs from memory, folk tunes from the Rhineland, lullabies from childhood. The melodies rose softly, fragile against the roar of engines, reminders that even in captivity, the human voice carried defiance. The American guards, to their surprise, were neither cruel nor vindictive. Most maintained a detached formality, treating the women as burdens to be transported rather than enemies to be punished. Meals were issued with clockwork efficiency, bread softer than what they had known for years, tins of meat, even coffee that steamed in tin cups. The women exchanged astonished glances, tasting abundance where they had expected deprivation. One murmured, almost in disbelief, "They feed their prisoners better than we fed our children." It was not said with gratitude, but with bitterness, a confession of the gulf that separated their world from that of their captors. As the voyage continued, a shift began to take place within them. Fear, though never fully gone, gave way to a cautious kind of observation. They noticed how the Americans moved, confident, casual, unhurried. They noticed the efficiency with which orders were carried out, the ease with which supplies were distributed, the unshakable rhythm of the ship's routine. Every detail suggested a nation unbowed, a society that had mobilized not only armies, but entire systems. The women compared these impressions with their memories of Germany's chaos, shattered rail lines, shortages, endless queues for bread that never arrived. Slowly, the realization began to dawn, not yet fully formed, but pressing against the edges of their minds, that perhaps the war had been lost long before they themselves were captured. And yet, beneath these dawning insights lay the ache of absence. Each carried the weight of loved ones left behind, parents under bombardment, siblings pressed into combat, children whose fates were unknown. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, seemed to stretch that separation into eternity. One woman traced her finger along the wood grain of the bunk, whispering her son's name with every knot she found, as if counting them might summon him across the water. Another clutched her photograph so tightly the edges tore, the image smudged by salt and sweat. Captivity might keep them alive, but it also sealed them away from those they yearned to protect. By the time the ship neared the American coast, anticipation tangled with dread. They rose early on the day the harbor came into view, pressed against the narrow portholes, craning for a glimpse. At first, only a thin line appeared, blurred by mist. Then, slowly, the shapes of cranes, warehouses, and rail lines emerged, stretching across the shoreline in a spectacle of scale none of them could have imagined. Smoke from factories curled into the sky, freight trains rattled along tracks, and trucks rolled in ceaseless columns. The harbor pulsed with activity, as though the war were merely a distant echo, incapable of slowing this colossal engine. For the German women, the sight struck harder than any bomb. This was not the America of propaganda posters, decadent and fractured. This was a nation that had mastered industry itself. The women stood silent, each grasping the enormity of what they saw. Some covered their mouths as if to keep their astonishment from spilling out. Others muttered words of disbelief, their voices trembling with equal parts awe and despair. One wrote later, "It was as if we had opened a door to the future, and it was not ours." That first glimpse was not simply a view of a foreign land. It was a revelation of why their own had fallen. The strength of America was not in its soldiers alone, but in the inexhaustible machinery that carried them across oceans, fed them, clothed them, armed them, and now, as prisoners, these women were to live within the very system that had undone their world. They had left Germany in smoke and ruin. They now entered America in thunder and steel. The shift was not subtle, it was seismic. forcing them to reconcile the myths they had believed with the reality before their eyes. Their footsteps echoed down the gangplanks as they were led into waiting trucks, engines rumbling beneath them. For the first time since capture, their silence was not born of fear, but of recognition. The war they had lived through was only part of a larger story, and they were about to witness its other half. What awaited them inside this land of abundance remained a mystery, but already the first shock had taken root, the realization that their enemy was far stronger, far richer, and far more prepared than they had ever imagined. The trucks rumbled through the harbor gates, their steel frames vibrating with the weight of human silence. The German women sat crowded in the back, wooden benches beneath them, eyes fixed on the blur of movement beyond the tarpaulin flaps. What they saw through those narrow openings staggered them. Rows upon rows of cranes clawed at the sky, their steel arms lifting cargo containers the size of houses with the ease of children stacking blocks. Trains, endless and insistent, snaked along parallel tracks, hauling coal, grain, and weapons without pause. Forklifts darted like insects, stacking crates marked with stenciled letters. Ammunition, medical, rations. None of it seemed chaotic. Every movement was part of a rhythm, a grand choreography of labor and machinery. For the women, raised on propaganda that depicted America as soft and decadent, this was the first tremor of disillusion. One of them, the machinist's daughter, who had carried her father's photograph across the ocean, pressed her forehead against the wood. She had grown up in a German town where factories clanged and hissed, where her father's hands came home each night, coated in iron dust. She knew the sound of production, the fatigue etched into workers' faces. But what she glimpsed here was different. Not desperation, not exhaustion, but a hum of energy that seemed inexhaustible. Every dock worker moved with precision. Every machine fed another, as if the city itself was alive. For the first time, she wondered whether Germany had ever truly stood a chance. The convoy rolled deeper into the port, and with each turn, the evidence grew harder to deny. Warehouses stretched in unbroken lines, their doors yawning wide to swallow and exhale cargo. Trucks rumbled in columns along highways that shimmered with fresh tar, branching like arteries from the harbor's heart into the vast unknown. Overhead, aircraft circled lazily, the drone of their engines a reminder that the sky, too, belonged to America. The women exchanged brief glances, their expressions caught between awe and dread. They had expected victory monuments or triumphant banners. Instead, they were confronted by the quiet, matter-of-fact enormity of logistics. This was not a land struggling under war's burden. This was a land thriving through it. Inside the trucks, the women whispered cautiously, testing the air with their disbelief. One muttered that it must be for show, a stage set to impress prisoners. Another shook her head, pointing to the grease stains on the workers' overalls, the way their movements carried the fatigue of habit. A display could be polished, but it could not fake weariness, nor the unbroken hum of engines that stretched to the horizon. They fell silent again, each privately measuring the gap between what they had believed and what they now witnessed. The silence carried more weight than any argument. It was the silence of realization dawning, like a shadow creeping across the mind. The trucks slowed, passing under an archway adorned not with banners of conquest, but with advertisements for soap, radios, and refrigerators. Even amid war, commerce pulsed in plain sight. Shops along the roadside displayed goods unthinkable in Germany. Fabric bolts in bright colors, fruits stacked in pyramids, mannequins draped in dresses untouched by ration coupons. A child outside a grocery store licked an ice cream cone, and one of the German women gasped, unable to stop herself. Ice cream? In wartime? The guards ignored their surprise, the convoy moving on. But the image lodged itself in their thoughts. In Berlin, children combed through rubble for scraps of coal. Here, They strolled streets lined with neon signs and glass windows filled with abundance. The machinist's daughter found her gaze fixed on the passing storefronts. In the reflection of a department store window, she saw her own face, hollowed cheeks, hair dulled by salt and fatigue, contrasted against mannequins glowing under electric lights. She thought of her father, who had once told her that industry was the backbone of strength, that nations rose or fell on the might of their machines. How bitterly true his words seemed now. The America before her eyes was not merely surviving the war. It was thriving in it, reshaping itself into a force that could churn out more planes, more tanks, more rifles than her homeland could ever hope to match. She lowered her eyes, ashamed of the pang of envy that burned beneath her disbelief. When the trucks veered away from the harbor into the city's industrial districts, the scale grew even more staggering. Factories stretched like fortresses of steel and glass, their chimneys belching smoke that curled into the pale sky. The roar of machinery poured out of open doors, the clang of hammers on metal echoing like distant artillery. Yet, unlike the ruined factories of Germany, where broken windows rattled in empty shells, these buildings pulsed with vitality. Rows of women in coveralls moved with assembly line precision, riveting sheets of metal, feeding furnaces, guiding conveyor belts that never stopped. The prisoners stared, eyes widening at the sight of women working with an energy that rivaled any soldier's march. In Germany, women had worked too, but here the scale was vaster, the tempo faster, the results undeniable. One prisoner, older than the rest, leaned close to whisper, "Do you see? Even their women are part of the army." Her words carried both respect and fear. The machinist's daughter nodded faintly, recalling how her father had spoken of shortages, of delays, of how every shipment to the front was plagued by scarcity. Here, there seemed no such limits. Every rivet, every bolt, every engine that left these factories was part of a flood Germany could never stem. The realization was sharp, almost cruel. While they had been taught to believe in German superiority, the truth loomed before them in steel and smoke. As the trucks crossed a wide river spanned by bridges of concrete and steel, the women fell into silence once more. Barges drifted below, stacked with cargo. Above, trains thundered, laden with tanks whose turrets gleamed in the sun. The entire landscape seemed designed for movement, for the endless circulation of goods and power. It was not the grandeur of monuments or parades that struck them, but the relentless pulse of industry. America did not shout its strength. It displayed it in the quiet rhythm of production, a rhythm that made defeat feel not only inevitable, but foreordained. By the time the trucks left the city behind, the women were no longer whispering. Their silence was not imposed, but chosen, each prisoner locked inside her own reckoning. They thought of their families in Germany, queuing for meager rations, bartering for scraps, huddling in basements during air raids. How could they ever explain this sight to them? How could they describe the gulf between a land drowning in ruin and a land where factories hummed without pause? One woman buried her face in her hands, not to weep, but to shield herself from seeing more. Another clenched her jaw, her pride refusing to admit what her eyes could not deny. And still, the machinist's daughter stared, her mind racing with the memory of her father's words, her heart sinking under the weight of truth. The trucks eventually slowed again, turning toward the countryside. Barbed wire fences appeared, stretching around compounds dotted with barracks. Guards stood at the gates, rifles slung casually, their posture untroubled. The women understood they had arrived at their new reality, captivity on American soil. Yet even as they were led down from the trucks, boots crunching against gravel, their thoughts lingered on what they had seen. The prison camp itself mattered less than the revelation of the journey. That America was not the fragile enemy they had been taught to despise, but a force so vast, so organized, that it could wage war without ever feeling war's deprivation. That night, in the barracks where rows of bunks awaited them. The machinist's daughter lay awake long after the others had surrendered to exhaustion. She replayed every image: the cranes, the trains, the smoke-stacked factories, the neon signs. She imagined her father standing beside her, nodding with grim understanding, his words about industry echoing louder now than ever before. She knew then that the war had been lost not only on the battlefields, but in the very heart of production. Germany's guns had fired with fury, but America's machines had never stopped turning. She turned on her side, clutching the photograph she had carried across the ocean. For the first time, she felt not just the ache of defeat, but the clarity of its cause. Sleep would not come easily. The images were too vivid, the truth too sharp, and as the darkness pressed around her, a thought whispered unbidden through her mind, a thought she dared not share aloud. If this was only their first glimpse, what greater revelations waited in the days ahead? The camp was ringed by barbed wire, but the air that drifted through it carried the scent of bread. Fresh bread, soft and yeasty, a smell so foreign to the women that for a moment they forgot the fences, forgot the guards, forgot the weight of defeat. The machinist's daughter, still clutching the photograph of her father, closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She had stood in ration lines back home, had watched loaves shrink smaller and smaller, crusts growing darker and harder until they cracked like stone. Yet here, behind wire meant to confine her, abundance announced itself with something as simple as warm bread. The first meal was served in a long mess hall built of timber and steel. Rows of tables stretched endlessly, the surfaces polished to a dull shine. On each tray the prisoners received sat slices of bread, steaming bowls of soup, and, unbelievably, meat. Thick, salty chunks that filled the air with their scent, their edges glistening with fat. A guard ladled coffee into metal cups, its rich, bitter steam rising into the rafters. For a heartbeat, the women stared, frozen. Then, as if fearing it might vanish, they ate. Some devoured greedily, others cautiously, taking small bites, letting flavors linger on their tongues. One woman broke into tears mid-bite, ashamed of her trembling but unable to stop. She whispered of her child at home, who had not tasted such food in months. The others fell silent, their chewing suddenly heavier. The meal both gift and wound. Daily life unfolded in a rhythm unlike anything they had imagined for captivity. At dawn, the barracks filled with the shuffle of boots and the creak of wooden frames. Roll calls were brisk, the guards stern but not cruel. Work details followed. Some women were assigned to fields, tending vegetables under the hot American sun. Others sewed uniforms, mended equipment, or cleaned camp facilities. Each task was done under watchful eyes, yet the air lacked the cruelty they had feared. There were rules, punishments for disobedience, but also a strange predictability, a structure that allowed them to breathe. For many, it was the first stability they had known in years. And then there was the food, always the food. 3 times a day it appeared without fail. Trays filled with more than they could finish. Portions that seemed indulgent compared to the meager rations of Germany. Eggs, potatoes, butter, even fruit from cans that gleamed with syrup. The machinist's daughter turned each tin over, studying the labels. Peaches from California, pineapples from Hawaii, pears from Oregon. The very names felt like spells from a dream, conjuring lands she had never imagined. One evening, as she lifted a spoonful of peaches to her lips, she thought of her father telling her that steel and coal were the backbone of power. He had not mentioned fruit, yet here she tasted another kind of strength. The strength of a land so vast it could feed even its captives luxuriously. Whispers spread quickly through the camp. Letters trickled in from Germany, describing hunger, cold, and the ruin of cities flattened by bombers. Families survived on watery soup and turnips dug from frozen earth. children scavenging for coal dust. The contrast was unbearable. At night, the women lay awake in their bunks, stomachs uncomfortably full, guilt gnawing alongside satiety. Some wept quietly into their blankets, torn between gratitude for survival and grief for those left behind. Others tried to harden themselves, insisting that this abundance was nothing but a trick, a performance staged for their eyes. Yet each morning the bread returned, the coffee steamed, the abundance persisted. The lie, if it was one, was relentless. It was not only food that astonished them. On Sundays, the camp organized film screenings. In a large hall, prisoners were shown American movies, comedies with quick-talking actors, romances filled with laughter and dance. The machinist's daughter watched with a mixture of fascination and distance. She could not follow all the English, but the images spoke plainly enough. A society where men and women moved freely, where shops overflowed with goods, where war was mentioned only in passing. The laughter that filled the hall was uneasy, a laughter edged with envy and disbelief. Yet the films lingered in their minds afterward, stirring questions they had never dared ask. If this was the world outside the fences, what did it mean for everything they had been told of America? The guards themselves deepened the dissonance. They were young, many scarcely older than the prisoners. They smoked cigarettes, traded jokes, leaned casually against posts. Most treated the women with a politeness that was bewildering, opening doors, offering directions, even nodding greetings. One guard, noticing a prisoner struggling with her work, wordlessly helped her lift a heavy crate before walking away. Another once slipped an extra slice of bread onto a tray, glancing over his shoulder before moving on. Such gestures were small, but in their smallness lay power. They chipped away at the image of the enemy as brute or monster. For the women, each act of courtesy was both comfort and humiliation, proof that the enemy could show humanity where their own nation had shown only hunger and command. Not all prisoners adjusted easily. One woman, older and severe, refused to eat the bread, muttering that to accept it was to betray those starving at home. She grew thinner by the week, her defiance gnawing at her body. Another, once proud of her role in the Reich's auxiliary corps, broke down after watching an American truck unload boxes of canned goods labeled for prisoners. "Even their waste would feed us," she whispered, shaking until her bunkmates held her still. The camp, for all its order, became a crucible of contradictions. Safety laced with guilt, abundance shadowed by loss, kindness underscored by defeat. The machinist's daughter began keeping a diary. Writing on scraps of paper she hid beneath her mattress. Her entries shifted as the weeks passed. At first they brimmed with disbelief. Lists of foods, descriptions of machines, the strangeness of laughter in captivity. Slowly they grew more reflective. She wrote of the dreams that came to her at night. Dreams of her father walking through an American factory, marveling at conveyor belts and endless stacks of goods. She wrote of the taste of coffee, how it lingered on her tongue longer than any meal she had known in years. And she wrote of the ache that never left her. The knowledge that each bite, each comfort, was one her family would never taste. Her diary became not just a record of survival, but a confession of divided loyalties. Between her body, grateful for nourishment, and her heart, racked by grief. Season shifted into season. The women noticed how the American guards changed uniforms for warmth, how supplies arrived with clockwork regularity, how nothing seemed to falter. Even storms that swept across the camp failed to halt the flow of rations and work. The contrast to Germany was merciless. In their homeland, winter meant shortages, endless waiting, frost-bitten fingers fumbling for fuel. Here, winter meant thicker coats and hot meals without interruption. Each day confirmed the same bitter truth. The Reich had demanded sacrifice until there was nothing left to give. While America's system seemed to produce plenty even in the depths of war, yet abundance did not erase the ache of captivity. The women still longed for their families, still traced the outlines of photographs until the paper wore thin. Some composed letters they could never send, whispering the words aloud as if the air might carry them across the ocean. The machinist's daughter often imagined her father sitting at a bare table in their bombed-out town, listening to the distant echo of factory whistles. She wondered what he would think if he saw her here, eating peaches from a tin, writing by the light of an American bulb. Would he call it betrayal? Or would he simply nod, understanding at last why their nation had fallen? One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, the prisoners returned to the mess hall to find a surprise. On each tray sat a slice of cake, yellow sponge topped with a layer of cream, sweet and rich. The women stared in disbelief. Some laughed, a brittle sound. Others crossed themselves as if in prayer. The machinist's daughter lifted her fork slowly, tasting the sweetness with hesitation. The sugar melted on her tongue, sharp and intoxicating. For a moment she felt joy, untainted and immediate. Then it curdled into sorrow. She thought of children in Germany sucking on raw beets to ease hunger, of mothers boiling weeds for soup. She put the fork down, unable to finish. Around her, others did the same, their faces caught between pleasure and guilt. That night the barracks buzzed with quiet conversation. Some spoke of the future, wondering if they might remain in America when the war ended, if life here might hold something more than survival. Others dismissed the thought bitterly, reminding them that prisoners would be sent home whether they wished it or not. But the seed had been planted, fragile and persistent. For the machinist's daughter, it grew into a question that refused to leave her mind. A question that shaped itself in silence as she stared at the ceiling in the dark. If captivity could offer more dignity than freedom had at home, what did that mean for everything she had believed? And as she turned that question over, her heart tightened with both fear and anticipation, for she knew the answer was coming, and it would change her forever. The war ended not with the thunder of artillery, but with the quiet inevitability of surrender. In the camp, news came through radios guarded closely by American soldiers, their words terse and final. Germany had fallen. For the women behind barbed wire, it was less a shock than a confirmation of what their eyes had already told them. The Reich they had served, the Reich that promised destiny, was gone. Yet the greater revelation was not in headlines, but in what they had witnessed day after day in captivity. The true power of America was not in its armies, but in its relentless capacity to provide, to build, to sustain. That truth had reshaped them more deeply than any battlefield loss. The machinist's daughter carried this realization with a quiet gravity. Each morning she traced the creases of her father's photograph, her thoughts no longer bound only to memory, but to comparison. She remembered the smoke-choked factory of her childhood, the long queues for bread, the shortages that hollowed faces into masks of survival. Then she thought of the American cranes at the harbor, the endless trains, the meals that never faltered even in the depths of war. She understood now, with the clarity of lived experience, that her father's wisdom about industry had been correct, but it was America, not Germany, that had mastered the lesson. She did not voice these thoughts aloud. Silence was safer, and pride still lingered stubbornly among her fellow prisoners. Yet within her, the understanding had become a kind of reckoning. Among the women, conversations grew heavier as letters arrived from home. Some brought news of survival, but most carried stories of ruin. Towns flattened, families scattered, hunger gnawing through the bones of children. A prisoner who once wept with joy over canned peaches now wept with guilt, realizing her brothers scavenged ruins while she ate plenty. Another clutched a letter describing her parents' death in a bombing raid, her grief amplified by the bitter knowledge that she was alive in a land where food was abundant and roofs unbroken. The camp became a place of echoes, echoes of laughter from American movies, echoes of sorrow from a broken homeland. echoes of a war that had collapsed under its own weight. The women wrestled with the duality of their existence, captives of the enemy, yet beneficiaries of his mercy. The guards, too, became part of this strange education. Their casual gestures, sharing cigarettes, offering directions, speaking without contempt, wore down the last illusions of propaganda. These were not the barbarians they had been taught to fear. They were men and women who lived with an ease born of security, of confidence in a system that never seemed to falter. The machinist's daughter once overheard two guards joking about baseball, a game she could not understand. What struck her was not the words, but the tone. Light, unburdened, as if the weight of the world could be set aside for play. She marveled at the luxury of such detachment. In Germany, even laughter had felt rationed. As months passed, release became the next inevitability. Rumors swirled of repatriation, of ships preparing to carry them back across the Atlantic. Some women clung to the thought with relief, desperate to return to their families. Others felt dread, knowing they were leaving a land of abundance for one of ruin. The machinist's daughter felt both. At night, she dreamed of her town, of her father's silent figure at a workshop bench. But when she awoke to the smell of coffee, to the steady rhythm of a camp that never failed to feed its prisoners, she felt a pang of fear at the return. What awaited her on the other side of the ocean was not just home, but devastation. The day the gates opened for departure, the women stood in line with small bundles of belongings. They looked leaner but healthier, their cheeks no longer gaunt, their eyes sharpened by what they had seen. The machinist's daughter held her father's photograph tighter than ever. Around her, others whispered prayers, promises, or nothing at all. The trucks rumbled once more, retracing the road toward the harbor. Yet, this time, the sight of cranes and trains did not stun them into silence. It confirmed a truth they already carried. America's might was not fleeting, not staged. It was the steady pulse of a nation that had turned industry into destiny. As they boarded the ships for the return voyage, the machinist's daughter paused at the top of the gangplank. She looked back at the shore, at the warehouses stacked high, at the workers moving with tireless precision. She knew she would never forget the sight, that it would haunt her as much as it inspired her. She thought of Germany's ruins waiting for her, of the hunger she would face again, of the struggle to rebuild from ashes. But she also thought of what she had seen in America, an echo of possibility, proof that strength was not only in armies, but in how a nation cared for its people, even its prisoners. She stepped onto the deck, the photograph still warm in her hand, her heart heavy with both loss and revelation. For the rest of her life, she would carry the memory of abundance behind wire, the shock of bread and peaches and kindness where she had expected cruelty. And as the ship turned east, cutting a path across the vast Atlantic, she felt the echo of that shock settle deep inside her, a reminder that defeat was not only measured in battles lost, but in the undeniable realization of how completely another world had outbuilt her own